Welcome back to America's Commercial Real Estate Show. This segment is brought to you by Real Crowd. Did you know that you can invest with experienced sponsors online right now in big commercial real estate deals? Visit realcrowd.com. Well, today we're talking retail and retail real estate. I have Sam Arden here with us. He's a partner with Hartman Simons, and we're talking retail. And Sam, one of the things that I think a lot of people are concerned about is all the bankruptcies we're hearing about, all the troubles with all these retailers. What are you really seeing? Are you seeing a lot of that out there today?
Michael, yes, we're seeing quite a bit of it. It's been a trend for the last few years, actually. There's transitions going on in the retail sector with tenants struggling, tenants with too much debt, lease obligations that are beyond what they can handle, and many of them are turning to bankruptcy to try to reorganize. And in many instances, they're not reorganizing; they're going away. They're liquidating. Yeah. So we're losing tenants.
So what's that mean for the leases? If you're a landlord or a lender, what's that mean for your lease and your income stream?
Well, it varies. Believe it or not, every so often I have clients who are glad to see a tenant go because the opportunity to replace that tenant is a better economic opportunity than the tenant who's in bankruptcy. Okay. Not because they're in bankruptcy, it's just that there may be more rent available, better lease terms available
from a new tenant.
A new tenant. Yeah. So that's the best case scenario. Then you have what's the most obvious impact to the landlord, which is a tenant may be terminating its lease in bankruptcy and going away, and you're losing the rental stream from.
And do you lose it as a landlord the minute they file?
You do not lose it the minute they file, depending on what they plan to do with your space. Many of these tenants will continue operating post-bankruptcy until they figure out which, for example, they may be trying to reduce the number of locations they have. So while they're sometimes they have that figured out on the front end, sometimes they're figuring it out, the tenants are figuring it out during the bankruptcy. During the bankruptcy process, if they're in the space operating, then they need to pay your rent moving forward until they terminate the lease.
And they're supposed to pay the normal rental rate then, if they're open and operating, even though they're in bankruptcy?
Yeah, the bankruptcy doesn't change the financial terms of the lease. So if they are in the space, they should pay the monthly rent. And there are different types of charges that arise under retail leases that create problems for how to calculate what's owed. Like, for example, a tenant may pay a portion of real estate taxes for the shopping center, and it may pay it in biannual installments or something, and it creates a problem for how you apply the bankruptcy code to the rental obligations. But the monthly rent is pretty clear cut.
Okay. So, and what are your rights if your tenant's in bankruptcy and you own a retail center and they're not paying the rent?
Well, what is owed as of the date of the bankruptcy goes into essentially a holding pattern while the tenant tries to figure out what it's going to do with the
back
lease.
Rent.
The back rent, yeah,
okay.
The past due rent that's due on the date they file. Okay. But they should be paying the rent moving forward, again, if they're operating in the space. Mm-hmm. And if the tenant does not, the landlord has the right to file a motion and force the tenant to pay that rent that's owed.
Okay. And are some of these tenants using bankruptcy to maybe cram down these rental rates and things on landlords?
Correct. Mm-hmm. So, and often it starts before the bankruptcy. The larger retailers will hire consultants that will approach landlords about reducing the rent rates. Then if they file for bankruptcy, what the common thing that a landlord is going to hear is, you need to work with us and we'll stay, but you need to reduce the rent, and if you don't, we're going to terminate your lease using the bankruptcy power to do it. So that's common in the landscape of retail today, that the landlords are hearing from the tenants, we need to renegotiate.
Yeah.
So.
Well, and this also impacts the other tenants in the centers out here, right?
That's correct.
Yeah.
So it impacts, what it can do actually is, one, a shopping center is, the tenants benefit from each other's presence.
Right, it's a big family, it's a nucleus, it works together.
It's the term tenant mix.
You're
and
right.
The developer, the landlord is always trying to get a good tenant mix,
right.
and these retailers, cross-pollinate, so to speak, and you attract shoppers to the shopping center. So a loss of a tenant can impact the traffic at the shopping center. But there's also certain covenants and leases that can be impacted, other tenants' leases that can be impacted.
Yeah, co-tenancy rights and things like that, right?
Oh yeah. So we were talking earlier about, from the best case scenario of losing a tenant to the worst case scenario, starting down that road, we have the loss of rent from the tenant. But it can get far worse for the landlord if that tenant that goes into bankruptcy and then terminates its lease, if it's the subject of a co-tenancy provision in another tenant's lease, that co-tenancy provision can provide that other tenant termination rights and a right to pay reduced rent, or both, an option of both until that tenant is replaced. And so there can be a domino effect from the loss of a tenant.
Yeah. And how long do these bankruptcies typically take?
Well, they can take. It depends. Some of them are. Some of these retailers are in worse shape than others. So they go in and they only have a short period of time in the bankruptcy. They only have a certain amount of money to continue to fund themselves. And so those bankruptcies, they may, for example, there've been a number of them where they've made an effort to sell themselves.
Okay.
They're in Chapter 11, but they're not really reorganizing. They're trying to sell themselves. They have 60 to 90 days sometimes of funding, and then if they're not successful, then it turns into a liquidation. And then the bankruptcies can be around for years, but it's really just a cleanup, and the business operation is gone. If it's a reorganization, though, it can be more of an active bankruptcy, but there are deadlines in the bankruptcy code that limit, in a retail context, how long these can take. In particular, the tenants have a certain amount of time to make a decision about the leases.
Okay.
And beyond that, the landlords have to consent to that. And if you have hundreds or thousands of landlords, it's very difficult to get everybody on board.
Right. And we're talking with Sam Arden with Hartman Simons about retail and retail real estate and about bankruptcies. And I guess some of these things with bankruptcies and tenants could happen really with any type of tenant. We're just seeing it a lot in retail today, or too much.
Correct.
So what should a landlord think about, Sam, if they feel like they're getting threatened maybe verbally or with letters from a tenant that, look, if you don't renegotiate our lease, we're going to file bankruptcy? What should they do at that point?
Well, I think they need to consider it. I mean, the landlord should know the economic circumstances of their asset, and they should know, or they should have legal counsel, if they don't know, what the impact is going to be of the loss of the tenant. Because if the loss of the tenant is going to have the mushroom impact, of domino effect on other tenants, then you may have more incentive to work with the tenant. Yeah. If it's just an issue of rent relief, reduced rent, and there's no other impact from losing the tenant, then it's more of a focused decision for the landlord to decide whether they want to work with them or not. And I think in amending a lease to reduce the rent, you may want to put in a few more bells and whistles that deal with the potential bankruptcy coming up.
Yeah, so. So that's a good point. So if you're renegotiating the rent, you're lowering the rent, try to get some other advantages while you're right there doing that.
Right. I mean, you don't want to necessarily make the lease more attractive for the tenant to then go sell, because leases, there's a market for leases in bankruptcies, and they can go out and they have increased powers to sell the leases.
Yeah. So. Well, that's a good point. Well, Sam, thanks for joining us on Studio One here. Good information.
Thank you, Michael.
And stay tuned. We're going to have more on retail and retail real estate after this short break. And if you will, let us know what you think. Comment below if you're on YouTube or iTunes or the show website, and connect with us. Stay with us. I'll be right back. This is America's Commercial Real Estate Show.